On a calm morning in September of 1931, a young woman, bruised and bloodied, stumbled into the Honolulu police station. Talia Massey, the wife of a white Navy officer, said she had been headed home from a night of dancing and was abducted, beaten, and raped. She claimed her attackers had been a group of young Hawaiian men. This accusation, the identification of those men, began what would become known as the Massey Affair, a Depression-era scandal and controversy that encompassed 2 trials, sometimes referred to as Hawaii's Emmett Till case. Like with Till, the accusation was from a white woman, and there was incredible violent response to the non-white suspects. The difference between Talia Massey and Carolyn Bryant in the Till case was that Talia had clearly been assaulted, but the men that she had accused had solid alibis. 2 of them physically could not have been there. Who was Massey protecting? Why those men? This is an exploration of America's decades of inequalities experienced at the cross-section of race and justice. How different results can be purchased based on wealth, privilege, and connection. The media fanning the flames of outrage, dubbing Massey a woman of refinement and culture, while the accused were fiends and thugs. Sound familiar? The laws governing the protection of women from violence, the laws promising equality to people of color, and where the laws failed both of those protections. We're on the road in a long boat ride or a flight to sunny Honolulu to investigate the Massey Affair on today's Highway to Hell. Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hell, the travel and true crime podcast. Every week we'll discuss a true crime story or a paranormal story sometimes, and then give travel recommendations at the end of the episode. My name is Monty. I'll be your host. I am a rock vocalist and personal trainer based in Nashville, Tennessee, for now. And I decided to do something with the 2 things I'm most passionate about that are not music and fitness, which is travel and true crime. So here we are. I'm back in Nashville for a couple weeks after traveling in my car for 30 days in the month of April. I am planning to rent out my apartment permanently and live on the road basically 50% of the time starting in July. So I'm in the process of working all of that out and figuring how I'm going to make that work, playing with my band here in Nashville. Really excited. As soon as I made that choice, everything felt better. I just felt lighter and happier, and I have the next 13 weeks of episodes planned out. What places am I traveling? What places have I been recently? Like all these things, everything's mapped out. And I have a very special surprise for next week. Not next week, sorry, 2 weeks from now when I come to episode 10. Every 10th episode, I'm going to have a little bit of a surprise for you. So we are going to jump in. So grab your leis, grab a tropical drink. We're going to go to Hawaii. Captain Cook, like European settlers centuries before him, arrived in a new land in the late 18th century and immediately branded natives as savages, yet another group of indigenous people in need of white guidance and civility. Not long after, missionaries arrived, and then plantations were established, and they established a new lower class of Hawaii, Native Hawaiians and Asian immigrants. In 1893, white settlers overthrew Queen Liliuokalani and ended the Kingdom of Hawaii. By the way, there are a lot of Hawaiian names in here, and I have pronunciation notes for all of them. I will do my best. I may trip over them a little bit, but I practiced. The U.S. immediately established a heavy military presence in their new strategic point in the Pacific Ocean, Pearl Harbor. By 1930, shortly before the Massey Affair, the social hierarchy had been established, and what it was the minority wealthy white business owners and the white military members, firmly on top, the majority Asian and Pacific Islander population. Talia, named after the Greek muse of comedy, was born on Valentine's Day, 1911, to Grace and Granville Fortescue. Her mother was the niece of Alexander Graham Bell, and her father was the son of Robert Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, uncle. Something to note, he was the illegitimate son of Robert Roosevelt. She was raised in a socially prominent family with leisures and education that afforded, as well as a lot more freedom and influence, the ability to get away with a lot more. She did not inherit the grace of her mother. I don't know why English is so hard today. She did not inherit the grace of her mother or the charisma of her father. She was headstrong, impetuous, snobby, and described as rash. Now, based on what I've read about Talia, I think some of this is warranted. She does come across as this very, like, socially privileged, spoiled, kind of temperamental, tantrumatic kind of girl. But at the same time, some of the things that she gets accused of is really that she just didn't fall into all of the societal norms for women that people thought that she should have. An example of this is that when she was moved to Hawaii with her husband, the Navy wives would be attending flower arranging classes and hula classes, and she insisted on enrolling back in university and continuing her education that had ended when she married Lieutenant Thomas Massey at 16. However, it does seem that she struggled with a certain degree of mental illness, such as depression or possibly bipolar disorder. Bipolar wasn't even a known disorder at this time, and depression, which was known as melancholy in the 1800s, was still being studied and really identified. At this time, the symptoms of depression would be treated with hydrotherapy, metrazole convulsion, and insulin shock therapy. The consequences of mental health disorders reflected the class system in America. If you were wealthy, you were called impetuous or eccentric. The poor were locked away and left to die. The romantic vision she had of being a Navy wife, travel, and adventure wore off real fast. She quickly grew tired of nothing to do but social engagements and polite, shallow conversations. For all of her faults, she really does seem to be an intellectual woman who really got sick of, I just show up and I look pretty. I relate. That is not a lifestyle that I would thrive in. She grew up used to doing whatever she wanted. Now she had this box she had to live in because in the Navy at that time, a big part of promoting your career was socializing, and your wife was a part of that. She had to look the part, be the part. She needed to be charming, all of that stuff. And women during this time, a little bit of note on equality, is that if you did not have a husband who really supported your growth outside of traditional norms, it was really difficult to do. So an example I think of is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. When she went to law school, she was one of, I believe, 5 women who were allowed into the law class at Harvard that year. And her husband was super supportive of her. He was on board. He was on board throughout her entire career. And I mean, when he got cancer in law school, she helped him pass. She helped him. She went to all his classes for him. She took notes for him. She notated for him when he couldn't type on his own. But unless you were in that kind of partnership, it was really hard to break out of gender norms. You couldn't find jobs. You couldn't rent an apartment. You couldn't get credit. None of that stuff. So Talia was in this interesting intersection where she was not in that kind of marriage, but she was an intellectual. She was highly educated, especially for women of the time. But she was expected to just show up to parties, be social, go to classes, keep your home, all of those things. So she gets married at 16. By 20, she would often leave gatherings early, which strained her marriage because, again, networking and socializing were critical to furthering a Navy career. Her dislike of these type of encounters caused her to be the subject of gossip for the other wives on base. So they're going to their bridge meetings or whatever, and they're talking about, oh my gosh, did you hear about Talia? She walked out of this party. It was super, super looked down upon. Her husband threatened to send her back to her parents if she didn't improve her behavior. But on the night of September 12th, 1931, joining her husband for a party seemed better than the alternatives. Their marriage was on the rocks, and she knew it would lead to another night of heavy drinking for Tommy and his naval buddies. But after an hour of conversation over bootleg liquor, remember that prohibition wasn't repealed until December 5th, 1933, the Masseys left their home and around 9:30 drove their Model A Ford to Alawai Inn. Saturdays was Navy night. 50 cents could buy you 4 hours of dancing until 1 a.m. Well, around 11:30 p.m., Talia was visibly irritated with Tommy, who had ignored her in favor of his friends for the last 2 hours. When a drunk submarine skipper went to the bathroom, she promptly plopped down in his seat. When he got back, he demanded his seat back. How gentlemanly. And she refused. He called her a louse, which is hilarious to me, and she slapped him hard across the face. After Tommy intervened, Talia declared herself bored, and she left the party early, as she was prone to do, and she started walking toward the beach, which is an interesting thing. So she leaves. Nobody argued that she left at 11:30, and her husband presumably was just going to let her walk home alone in the middle of the night after drinking. It's just an interesting little tidbit. Tommy assumed his wife would find her way home, and he continued to party. The party even spilled over to a fellow officer's home. Just before 1 a.m., Talia flagged down a car on Ala Moana Road. Two couples in the car stopped by, and one wife later reported that Talia had a badly swollen face, which later turned out to be a broken jaw. She had swollen lips and a gash on one of her cheeks, but that her evening gown seemed to be in good condition. She told the couples that she had been robbed, but refused to go to the hospital and asked to be driven home. A few minutes later, Talia answered the phone at home. Tommy had called her to check on her, and she told him, "Come home, something awful has happened." When her husband arrived, she said that she had been gang raped by a group of Hawaiians. This was different than the story that she told the couples who found her, but this is the story that she would tell police. Her story felt perfectly in line with Hawaii's racist class system. Just like Captain Cook's opinion, it had to be one of those savages. Other theories and suspects, like her husband, weren't even considered, but more on that later. At the same time Massey flagged down the car, another woman, Agnes Peoples, appeared at Honolulu's downtown police station reporting that she had been assaulted by a man after a near car accident. She claimed that the young Hawaiian had shoved her and hit her in the ear. She gave the police the license plate number, which was 58-985. It was only an hour after that Tommy Massey called to make a report that his wife had been assaulted. Talia said the car that she was abducted in was old and dark, but she couldn't remember the license plate because there wasn't enough light. Police immediately believed that this was the same group of men and traced the license plate to a light-colored tan Model A Ford belonging to an unmarried Japanese woman. They found out that her son had been driving the car that night. The night of the attack, Horace Ida, a young Japanese American, along with some friends, had been in that near crash with Agnes Peoples in downtown Honolulu. One of his friends was prizefighter Joseph Kahahawe. This minor collision did lead to a confrontation with Kahahawe, these are hard, Kahahawe, and a woman, Peoples, exchanging blows. Ida and Joseph, along with other passengers in their car, Benny Ahakuelo, David Takai, and Henry Chang, were all arrested. Police marched all 5 men in front of Massey, who identified them as her attackers. Talk about lazy police work. You're not going to interview anybody. You're not going to check alibis. You're not going to do anything. You're just going to be like, it's got to be these guys. They got in a fight with this woman after a car crash. It's got to be them. So a couple of interesting things happened after this. After a thorough medical examination, a nurse informs Detective John McIntosh that there is no evidence of intercourse of any kind, describing Talia as clean as a new pin. That would be extremely difficult to achieve in a gang rape, or if she had just had sex with someone. There would be some kind of evidence that intercourse had happened, but there was none. But then Talia tells detectives she caught a fleeting glance of the license plate and says she thinks it was 58-905. That's one number from the plate that Peoples reported. The police knew this couldn't be coincidence, and it wasn't, but not for the reasons that they thought it was. Radio messages reporting the license plate number had been heard by members of Massey's party at the hospital, and a friend of Massey's had been told the plate number directly by one of the detectives. I'm going to go into what I think happened at the end of this episode, so sit tight. Just try to make some mental notes of this. It's some of the most lazy, ridiculous police work and downright framing ever. Very frustrating. The young men were arrested and dubbed the Ala Moana Boys, after the location where the attack reportedly took place. Police felt their case was fairly solid, but just to kind of help it along, McIntosh had another investigator take Ida's Model A Ford to the place where Massey said she was attacked and drive it back and forth in the mud so that they could then go and match the tire prints. So he intentionally took this car over to frame these men. More on that later. The news of the alleged rapes outraged the white community. Admiral Sterling, commandant over Hawaii's naval district, said that the brutes should be strung up on trees. News blasted headlines that a woman of highest character, which meant she was white, was raped by a gang of fiends, which meant they weren't white. Despite the outrage and a glaring problem that existed for the prosecution, it kind of seemed to be ignored, and that was the timeline. All 5 men had been witnessed at a dance in Waikiki until 12:15. Then they were at a party at a private home of a city supervisor until 12:30, seen and identified by multiple witnesses who came forward. The near accident occurred between 12:40 and 12:45 in downtown Honolulu. Talia Massey was found between 12:50 and 1 a.m., 6 miles away. How could 5 men drive across town after 12:40, abduct, have enough time for each of them to rape Massey, according to her, with her having enough time to get up and flag down a car no later than 1 a.m.? And this is in a car that averages 40 to 45 miles an hour. I'll give you a hint. That's not possible. Hawaii's princess, Kawananakoa, the last of the Hawaiian monarchy, appealed to William H. Heen, the only Democrat in Hawaii's Senate, to meet with the men. She was pleading with him that they were truly innocent. Heen eventually agreed to meet with the men, and after discussing the case, seeing that these men were truly innocent, that they could not have possibly committed the crimes, decided to represent them himself, along with his co-counsel, William Pittman. The case opened before Judge Alva Stedman on November 16, 1931. The jury included 7 non-whites and 5 whites. This is super important because when you look at historical cases involving race, a mixed jury is typically a lifesaver. Because to be honest, especially in times like this is before the Civil Rights Movement. In order for someone who is a person of color to be tried in front of a jury of their peers, if there's not a single person of color on that jury, in my opinion, it is no longer a jury of their peers. Massey was the first witness to be brought up for the prosecution. She said she left the Alawai Inn at 11:35 and walked 5 to 10 minutes before being picked up by the defendants. She claimed 2 men jumped out of the car and Kahahawa struck her in the jaw. She said she spent about 20 minutes at the scene of the rape after being dragged out of the car. But during cross-examinations, she said she couldn't recall making statements saying that all her attackers were Hawaiian or making the statement that she had been unable to see the license plate in the dark. Dr. John Porter, who examined her after the attack, was asked to explain how 4 to 6 men could have sexual intercourse with a woman without showing any sperm or any sign of intercourse. He could not explain that. Prosecutor Griffith White called Officer Claude Benton to testify that he had matched the tire treads of Ida's car to the scene of the crime. McIntosh's order obviously wasn't known at this time. Remember that McIntosh is the detective that told an officer to drive the car around the scene of the crime. Defense attorney Heen, however, was able to negate Officer Claude's testimony by raising serious questions about Benton's knowledge of tires and treads. He didn't know much, he wasn't trained, and he didn't have any experience. Detective Thomas Finnegan testified to Massey identifying her attackers, and our good old buddy Inspector Fuckface McGee McIntosh testified about her remembering the license plate after her friends and family had been told the number. I gotta hand it to defense attorney Heen. He played this extremely smart. He was so worried that if he went too tough on Talia, it would sour the jury toward his clients, which he was probably right. So instead of saying an attack never happened, even though he had the evidence to do so, he took the route of proving that police simply had the wrong men, not that the rape never occurred. So his argument was, his argument didn't take the route of, well, we don't have evidence that you were raped. It was, you guys have the wrong guy. Very smart. He called numerous alibi witnesses who placed the defendants miles away from the crime scene up until the moment of the crime. He was able to call witnesses that accounted for the men's whereabouts all the way up till 12:40. Remember that Massey was found just before 1 a.m. So up till 20 minutes before she was found, they had witnesses placing them 6 miles away. But there was another witness that helped increase the doubt that these men could have done it. The defense also produced witness who saw Talia walking down John Enner Road shortly before midnight, being followed by a white man. They were able to identify Talia and the dress that she wore that evening. Other witnesses created doubts about Massey's changing and improving memory as time went on. The defense attacked the integrity of the investigation when Officer Sato testified that he and Inspector Liar Fuckface McIntosh had drove Ida's car to the scene before Benton could identify the treads so that the car tracks would be there. So he was able to find a police officer that admitted an order had been given to frame these men. When the prosecution and the defendants rested, the jury deliberated for 97 hours before giving up. They were deadlocked 6-6, which is insane. Okay, you have no evidence that a rape occurred. You have evidence of an attack, but you don't have evidence that a rape occurred. You have evidence, eyewitnesses, multiple, placing these men 6 miles away up until the moment of the attack. And you have a confession that the police framed these men. But for the jury, they're still deadlocked. So all of the white people and one non-white person were like, no, they did it. And the other 6 were like, there's no possible way. What's wrong with you? Riots and fights broke out across Hawaii in the wake of the hung jury. Horace Ida was abducted by a group of sailors and severely beaten, barely rescued by a passing motorist, and Admiral Sterling called for a military takeover of Hawaii. This dude gets worse and worse. Him and Detective McIntosh are dirtbags. Meanwhile, Tommy Massey and Talia's mother, Grace, worried that a second trial would not give them the verdict they wanted. Grace's mother travels to Hawaii to meet with Tommy, and they hatch a little bit of a plan. So yeah, they're probably not going to get the verdict they want. I don't know, because there's no evidence of a rape and an ironclad alibi. I don't know. The police had no new evidence going into the second trial, and there's no way that they could guarantee an all-white jury, which, if they had been able to do that, then they could have gotten these men convicted very easily. The only way that they were going to get the verdict that they needed was they needed a confession. An attorney friend of Massey's said that they could not beat a confession out of someone because they couldn't use that in court. But if they could get a confession and maybe hide the bruises, the jurors could consider it. Joe Kahahaway had been required to appear at 8 a.m. every day to meet with a probation officer, even though he wasn't convicted. So on January 7th, 1932, Tommy Massey, disguised as a chauffeur, drove a rental car to the Judiciary Building. A soldier, Deacon Jones, and another sailor, Edward Lord, had been recruited to help. But when Kahahaway left the building, Jones ran up to him, grabbed the arm, and waved a crude imitation of a military summons in his face. When Kahahaway hesitated because he knew that this was a false paperwork, Jones pulled out a gun and forced him into the car. A friend of Joseph witnessed the abduction and ran into officials in the Judiciary Building and reported the abduction right away. They immediately took Joseph to Grace Fortescue's rented home, since she still lived on the East Coast, and they tied him up there. Radio transmissions immediately went out, advising officers to look for a blue Buick sedan, which was the rented car, believed to be involved in the kidnapping. At 10:20 a.m., Detective George Harbottle spotted a large sedan with drawn back shades and decided to investigate. This turned into a high-speed chase, and the vehicle refused to pull over even after Harbottle fired shots at it. Finally, the detective was able to force the car off the road. Inside the car was a blood-soaked bedsheet wrapped around a body. He immediately arrested Grace Fortescue, Tommy Massey, and Edward Lord. Investigators flocked to the Fortescue house and arrested Deacon Jones, who was holding a whiskey glass in a room that he had just cleaned of blood. They found ropes, guns, Kahahaway's clothing, and his blood. Admiral, you racist piece of garbage, Sterling could not fathom that Grace and his soldiers would have to spend a night in jail, so he secured approval to house the prisoners in a decommissioned ship in Pearl Harbor, where they enjoyed luxury accommodations courtesy of the U.S. Navy, and messages of sympathy and support poured in from white business owners and the white population of Honolulu. Some newspapers dubbed it an honor killing. The highest attended funeral in Hawaii's history was the death of its last queen 15 years earlier. The second most attended was Joe Kahahaway. Many of the mourners remarked how the whites were shameless. The onlookers knew that this was no honor killing. It was a lynching. On January 21st of 1932, a grand jury almost didn't indict the four murderers, and likely wouldn't have, if it hadn't been for repeated reminders from Judge Albert Christie that their job was just to determine if there was enough evidence to show a crime had been committed, not if the defendants were innocent or guilty. He repeatedly reminded them of their duty, and he told them that it required them to lay aside all their racial prejudice, and if they could not do their duty, they needed to resign immediately. Eventually, they returned a vote of 12-8 to indict for second-degree murder. Good on this judge. This judge would not let this grand jury off the hook. He was like, no, you're not just going to disregard this because you think that this person deserved to die. It's crazy to me. As I read so many court documents and news articles, and obviously we know that there's such a history of racism anywhere that was colonized, right? But reading these articles, and this is the 1930s, and just how blatant and aggressive it is, it really is so encouraging to see people like this judge who are like, no. We're going to have justice in this house. In 1932, Clarence Darrow was 75 and a few years into his retirement. He was America's greatest defense attorney and had a staunch record of defending underdogs, and actually had a very progressive view on racial issues. He was an unlikely choice to defend four whites in a lynching, but the Great Depression had taken a toll on his investments and retirement, and the princely fee that they promised, a sensational trial in paradise, caused him to agree. There was no doubt that the defendants had killed Joe Kahahaway, so Darrow had to find some other circumstance that would give an acquittal, and Darrow decided to fly in a team of psychiatrists to lean into temporary insanity. Prosecutor John Kelly didn't need to prove who fired the shot. Under the laws for felony murder, if one of them killed him, all four were guilty because they were all part of the plot to kidnap and hold him hostage. He just needed to be able to battle Darrow to a jury comprised of 7 whites and 5 non-whites. Kelly provided witnesses Edward Wee, who witnessed the abduction, and identified Deacon Jones and Grace Fortescue as the abductors. He interviewed Detective Harbottle, who described the arrest of the 3 defendants and the body that he had found in the car. He provided Joe Kahahoe's blood-stained and bullet-torn shirt found in Grace Fortescue's house. He proved that Joe was seated when he was shot while his killer stood over him. They provided pictures of Grace's blood-stained floors. Kelly passed the jurors a rope that bound Joe's body. Detective Arthur Stagwar testified that they found buttons from Kahahoe's shirt under the Fortescue's wash basin. A gun salesman proved that the bullet removed from the body matched the empty round in Jones' .32 caliber Colt, a gun the man had sold him. The evidence of guilt was overwhelming. Darrow called Tommy Massey as his first witness and immediately questioned him about the rape of his wife. Prosecutor Kelly objected, arguing that the rape case was only relevant if it caused insanity in the defendants. Darrow said, "That's exactly what I'm going for." Tommy was allowed to continue and described his grief and anger from not being able to protect his wife from the rapists, and that she would wake up screaming. He said that he himself lost weight, he couldn't sleep, he worried his wife would become diseased or pregnant as a result of the attack. He claimed that she did in fact get pregnant, and a couple decided to abort her pregnancy. Now, I searched everywhere for this, and there is no record at all that she was ever pregnant after the attack. She did have a miscarriage in the summer of 1931, prior to the attack, but there is no record anywhere of a pregnancy after that. Zero. None. Court was canceled the next day because Darrow was too hungover, but then Tommy resumed his testimony. According to him, the restrained Kahahoe maintained his innocence until he finally broke. According to Tommy, I said, "Now go ahead and tell the whole story. You know your gang was there." And suddenly he said, "Yes, we done it." The last thing I remember was that picture that came into my mind of my wife, and when he assaulted her, she prayed for mercy, and he answered with a blow that broke her jaw. The questions continued. And this is taken from the court transcript. Question: Did you have a gun in your hand when you were talking to him? Answer: Yes, sir. Question: Do you remember what you did? Answer: No, sir. Do you remember what became of the gun? No, I do not, Mr. Darrow. Do you know what became of you? No, sir. Darrow had 2 psychiatrists who testified Tommy was temporarily insane at the time of the shooting. How massively convenient. Darrow also called Talia Massey to the stand, where she produced a new and even more detailed version of the rape, claiming that it was Kahahoe who had broken her jaw after he had refused her request to pray. While many spectators cried during her testimony, Darrow noticed 2 jurors dry-eyed and cleaning their nails. The next scene is fun. When Prosecutor Kelly starts his cross-examination, he hands Talia a psychiatric questionnaire she had filled out a few years earlier. This questionnaire was particularly damning because it showed serious marital problems and articulated her disdain for her husband. On the witness stand, Talia flies into a fit of rage, rips the paper to shreds, throws it in the air. Kelly simply says, I love this line. This is a direct quote. "Thank you, Mrs. Massey. At last you've shown your true colors." Talia storms out of the witness stand into the arms of her husband, shouting to the courtroom, "What right has he got to say I don't love you? Everybody knows I love you." After Prosecutor Kelly provided rebuttal psychiatrists that declared Thomas Massey was perfectly sane during the murder, they had closing arguments. Darrow's closing arguments were broadcasted on the radio across the nation, and he moved many to tears. When speaking about Grace, he said, and I'm going to directly quote this because it's preposterous, but also pretty brilliant from a defense attorney perspective. "If you want to send Grace to the penitentiary, all right, go to it. If this wife and mother, this husband, and these faithful boys go to the penitentiary, it won't be the first time a penitentiary has been sanctified by its inmates. It won't be the first time the name of a jail will be remembered when every jailer has been forgotten. When people come here, the first thing they will wish to see is where the mother and husband are confined. If it should happen, that building will be the most conspicuous building on this island, and people will wonder at the cruelty and injustice of man." Holy shit. Like, there's no question that these 4 kidnapped and murdered a man. And they're just like, these people, I'm going to throw something. Anyways, After 47.5 hours of deliberation, the jurors announced that each defendant was guilty of manslaughter and leniency was recommended. Again, no question whatsoever that a man not convicted of any crime was abducted, held hostage, and murdered. And the jury comes back and says, guilty of manslaughter, not murder, even though it was premeditated, leniency recommended. Excuse me while I fly into a fit of rage. But it gets worse. It gets worse. It gets so much worse. Governor Lawrence Judd, who had the pardoning power, was in a pickle because he doesn't want to punish them because, the white people are going to be mad at him. But he doesn't want to upset a large ethnic group in the state because the people of color make up the majority of the population. The U.S. military is literally demanding pardons. That admiral who's been a jerk off the whole time, he's demanding pardon. Excuse me. And then, as Lawrence Judd, the governor, is sitting there debating on this, like, what am I going to do? Someone's like, you have a phone call. It's President Herbert Hoover calling to recommend no jail time. The president got involved in this. Okay. No jail. He wants no jail time for 4 people who have kidnapped and murdered a man in cold blood. So that's how complex and how high up this went. Like, the racism is just so deeply, deeply ingrained. The next part nearly made me break my computer. Judge Davis sentenced them all to 10 years with hard labor. Good job, Judge. A few minutes later, Governor Judd announces that he has commuted their sentences to 1 hour. 1 hour. 60 minutes for cold, hard murder. Deacon Jones was allowed to walk off and send a telegram to his mother that said, "Dear Mom, we'll be home soon. Keep the coffee hot. Albert." When I tell you, I had to take a break and storm around my apartment when I read that. Princess Kawananoka spoke for many of the less powerful and the less white voices in Hawaii when she said, "Are we to infer from the governor's act that there are 2 sets of laws in Hawaii, one for the favored few and one for the people generally?" And she was 100% right. The governor seemed to have second thoughts about this commutation, though. He refused all demands for a full pardon. He would not wipe their record. And he wrote a letter to the Secretary of Interior blasting Navy officials for their racist attitudes and requested a reassignment, which he was granted, of Admiral Sterling. During this time, investigations for the rape case are still ongoing and evidence is being gathered pursuant of a second trial. The Pinkerton Detective Agency had been called in to investigate further and give a report detailing whether they believed in the guilt or the innocence of the Ala Moana boys. I'm going to take a little bunny trail here because the Pinkertons are a super interesting historical group. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was founded in 1850 by Alan Pinkerton, a Scottish immigrant in Chicago. It became famous for its role in law enforcement and private security in the United States. The agency was initially established as a private detective and security service, and it quickly gained a reputation for its effectiveness in tracking down criminals and solving crimes that were beyond the capabilities of traditional police forces at the time. Historically, the Pinkerton Agency is significant for several reasons. One, they were very innovative in detective work. Pinkerton introduced several new investigative techniques, including undercover operations. He was the one who created the mugshot, the systematic use of surveillance, and records to track criminals. These methods were groundbreaking at the time and have become standard practice in law enforcement. Protection of railroads and businesses, which was number 2. During the latter half of the 19th century, the Pinkerton Agency was employed by many of the nation's railroads and large corporations to protect their assets, suppress strikes, and combat labor unions. Their role in these activities made them both a powerful ally to business interests and a formidable foe to the burgeoning labor movement. So when they actually became involved in protecting the railroads later in their history is really where the Pinkerton Agency became a lot more questionable. They were involved in several massacres, several violations of labor rights, but prior to that, they had been really well respected. They were instrumental in bringing down Jesse James' criminal gang, and they were involved in this. They were the premier detective agency of this time. Number 3, famous cases and figures. The Pinkerton Agency was involved, like I said, in a number of high-profile cases, including the pursuit of Jesse James. The agency's agents, known as the Pinkertons, became legendary figures in the American Old West. Number 4, labor conflicts. The Pinkerton Agency's role in labor disputes is perhaps one of the most controversial aspects of their history. Pinkertons were often hired by large corporations to infiltrate unions, suppress strikes, and protect strikebreakers, which sometimes led to extremely violent confrontations. The most notable of these is the Homestead Strike of 1892. Number 5, government service. During the Civil War, Allan Pinkerton organized a secret service to gather military intelligence for the Union Army, an operation that laid the groundwork for later U.S. intelligence efforts. So Allan Pinkerton and the detective agency that he created can really be credited to a large degree for establishing detective work as we know it, which led to the FBI, the CIA, and private investigation. It played a critical role in development of both private security services and public law enforcement practices in the United States, and influenced how security and investigative work is conducted even to this day. The best detectives in the world were called in to investigate this case. They handed Governor Judd a 279-page report in October of 1932 and said there was no possible way that the attack against Talia Massey had been committed by these men. All the charges were finally dropped. So much insanity. And just, again, another example of just the racial inequality in the foundations of America. And, this did make me go back and revisit Emmett Till's case, where a woman simply claimed he whistled at her and he was murdered for it. It's just truly, truly tragic. But these cases are so important that we understand them. And I will say that several scholars credit the Massey affair to a very positive social change. White Hawaiian residents challenged rich business owners who had literally pulled the strings for 2 years over this court case. And they challenged the military who had been enforcing this kind of classist social order. Hawaiian, Japanese, and Chinese community leaders banded together, and non-whites started voting in record numbers. They realized our disputes with each other are not nearly as important as making sure that we have justice under the law. And they came out, they voted in record numbers, and Hawaii became a strong progressive state. They had many racial progressive reforms long before the mainland did. David Stannard, who is the author of the book Honor Killing, How the Infamous Massey Affair Transformed Hawaii, said that Hawaii's progressiveness is the result of, quote, an earlier time when a semblance still remained of the idealism and solidarity that emerged following the confrontation with raw white power during our tumultuous rape and murder trials of 1931 and 32. So really what he's saying is that their progressiveness came because they really saw this kind of raw, brutal, and they said the right word, this shameless abuse of power. This shameless, 4 people murdering a man, fully knowing they're going to get away with it. And they were right. 1 hour? All right. So before I go into the travel portion, I want to talk about what I think happened. Because we know that Talia Massey was attacked. There's no evidence she was raped, but she was attacked. We know how she found out the later information. We know where the detectives try to frame these men. Here's what I think happened. So Talia Massey and Tommy Massey are on the rocks with their marriage. She's got a reputation for leaving these parties early. It's hurting Tommy's reputation. He's known to be an aggressive drunk when he drinks, which is part of the reason that particular night she almost didn't go with him. I think that after she got in that spat with that skipper when she took his seat, I think that she decided to leave and Tommy lost his shit. So there was those witnesses that saw Talia walking down the road being followed by a white man in a naval uniform. I think what happened is that her husband got really upset that she left again, and he followed her and he beat the crap out of her. Now keep in mind that beating your wife did not become illegal in the United States until 1920, which is interesting because in 1919 women were finally able to vote. And all of a sudden, the next year, you can't beat your wife anymore. Marital rape wasn't outlawed until 1945. Domestic violence didn't even enter jargon until 1973, and the Violence Against Women Act didn't show up till 1994. So, beating your wife wasn't really that frowned upon. And so what I think happened is he followed her out, he beats the shit out of her, he breaks her jaw. So now they've got to come up with a story to explain what happened to her, because she's probably scared of him now, probably doesn't want to ruin his career. He certainly doesn't want his career ruined. And so they agree. He's like, listen, flag somebody down. I'm going to go to my friend's house so I have an alibi, and I'm going to keep partying. Flag someone down, get home. I'm going to call you once you're home. So they decide to go with the robbery story. She gets home. And I think that that's why she went home instead of going to the hospital. She gets home. She waits for that call from her husband. She gets him to come home. Then they decide to up the ante and say that she was raped, like really lean into it. And I really think that that's what happened. I think that the men, when they got into that near accident with Agnes Peoples, it was just the unluckiest timing they could have possibly had. If that accident had happened a day later, they would never have been arrested. Because I think what the Masseys were hoping would happen is that she would come and say, I was abducted, I was beaten, I was raped, I couldn't see the men, I couldn't see the car. And then they would get sympathy, right? They would get sympathy. She would be shown so much mercy. He would get a lot of positive attention. He'd be off the hook, but nobody would get arrested. When that accident happened, those arrests get made. Now they're kind of on the hook for it, and they just lean into it. So I think that her husband beat her. That's my opinion on the Massey affair. Thank you for coming down the road with me to Honolulu, Hawaii. I am so sorry for my trouble with Hawaiian names. It's the consonants alternating with the vowels that's troubling. Let's jump into the travel portion of today's episode. I've been to Honolulu 3 times, and it is one of the most fabulous places I've ever been. Hawaii as a whole is so magical and gorgeous. Like, you can hike on a volcano, and then you're in this rainforest where they filmed Jurassic Park. The food is delicious, and obviously, like, it is truly, truly, truly an incredible paradise. It really is. Everyone should go. The people are also incredible. Native Hawaiians make up very little of the population at this point, which is really unfortunate, but the people really are truly incredible and hospitable and warm and welcoming. Let's jump into the travel notes. The travel portion for today is going to be a little bit different because I'm going to spend a little bit more time on like things to do, like touristy things versus the restaurants and bars, even though I am going to mention a few of those. And the reason is there's so many unique experiences in Honolulu that you're not going to get most places in the United States, especially. And the first thing that I will say is Pearl Harbor. And again, obviously super famous for obvious reasons. Really, really moving sight to go see. Because, you know, they have that bridgeway built. You walk out on the harbor, you're looking down to where the Arizona sank. And you're seeing these oil droplets come up to the surface. And as with a lot of like war memorials where a lot of people lost their lives, like it's very sobering. And I think that it's important to honor people who did make sacrifices like that. And I remember standing over it, and again, you're watching this oil come to the surface and you're just like, there's 3,000 bodies in that ship that they're never going to get out. And just really moving, really impactful. Obviously, such an important historical moment for the U.S. in relation to World War II, you know, because if Pearl Harbor hadn't happened and the U.S. didn't get involved, I think that we would see a much different Europe. I think that Hitler obviously would have won. And so it's just a really important historical monument, and it's very, very much worth the visit. I highly, highly recommend it. And then as far as Hawaii itself and the beauty that it offers, my number one recommendation, one of the most life-changing things I've ever done, is skydive. So obviously you can skydive lots of places. I took my very first skydive on the North Shore in Hawaii. And one, it was the most terrified I've ever been, but it was the most life-changing experience. If you're an adrenaline junkie, or you've always wanted to skydive, or you just decide you're going to do it in Hawaii. It is so just mind-numbingly beautiful. And I'll just tell you what happened. So I was in Hawaii with my younger brother. I took him on a trip down there. And we decided to go skydiving. It was his second jump. It was my first. And I'm ready. Like, I'm gung-ho. I'm like, let's do this. Yeah, I've wanted to skydive my whole life. And it wasn't until I get there, and they've got me outfitted. They've got me in my jumpsuit. They're showing me where everything is, what my pack is, and they run through how they want you to jump out of the plane. You meet your tandem jump leader. And it wasn't until I met my jump leader that I was like, holy shit, I'm about to jump out of a plane. And I remember making the joke. He was an older guy. And I was like, you know what? It actually is really encouraging to be jumping with someone of your age. And he laughs at me. He could tell I was joking. And he was like, what do you mean? I was like, well, you've survived this long. So we get into the plane. And I'm the kind of person, when I'm stressed or I'm scared, I just get quiet. I just get really silent. And I'm sitting on this plane, not speaking, not moving. I can barely breathe. And I remember there was this one girl just yippee yapping, and she would not stop talking. And it took all of my willpower and all of the kindness that I've fostered over the years to not say something very mean to her. But I'm sitting there in just sheer panic. My brother turns around. He was like, I can feel your anxiety from here. And we get up to 14,000 feet. And so what they do is when you get to the edge of the plane to jump, they have you cross your arms in front of you. And I thought it had something to do with the packs or jumping because you're strapped to someone else. No, the reason they have you do that is because you are so terrified. People will put their arms up and try to stop themselves on the airplane door. So what they do is they have you walk up and they're like, okay, cross your arms. They don't really tell you why. And then your tandem leader pushes you out of the plane because you won't jump. You'll freeze. And we jumped. And the moment leading up to the edge of the doorway is the most terrified I've ever been. And as soon as my feet left the door was the most alive I've ever felt. It was the most magical, one of the most life-altering experiences. And I will say that I think that it rewired my brain a little bit. There is something so powerful that happens in that moment, and it literally and figuratively gives you new perspective. The only thing that I can really compare it to in a mental sense is taking high doses of psychedelic mushrooms, which I'll get on a different side note on that later. Using mushrooms has cured my depression. Like what previously having suicidal depression, it has cured it. Skydiving had a similar mental effect on me. And we're falling from 14,000 feet and we burst through the clouds, and the Hawaiian Islands and the Pacific Ocean just open up in front of you. And it was so beautiful and breathtaking. I cannot recommend skydiving in Hawaii enough. Please do it. Please do it. The second thing I would recommend, again, fairly unique to Hawaii, is going diving with sharks. And again, some of you are going to be like, what is wrong with you? I'm not really worried about sharks, to be honest with you. I tried to get my brother to go open water shark diving with me. He wouldn't go. So we went in a cage, but it was still fun. So you take a boat out to where there, large schools of sharks or a lot of sharks in the area, and you swim into the cage, they lower you down, and it was really cool. I mean, we're talking, these were mostly Galapagos sharks, and I mean, they're like 15, 16 feet. One of them got close enough I was able to reach through the bars and put my fingers on it, which was really, I was like, I just pet a shark. Really, really cool. Of course, go to Waikiki Beach. It's a famous beach for a reason. It is beautiful. It is so breathtaking. Snorkeling, again, so much beautiful wildlife, reefs. I was able to swim with sea turtles, which was really cool. All of those things, again, a lot of times when I go to a different city, I'm like, I don't want to do the tourist stuff, but sometimes it's really worth it. So definitely go to Waikiki. I mentioned earlier in the episode that I'm a personal trainer. I lost 90 pounds. I'm actually training for my first Spartan race. And so if you're active, Hawaii is great because the weather is so beautiful. You can walk everywhere, you can bike, but the hiking is life-changing. And I have a couple recommendations for Honolulu for hiking, so make some notes. Definitely go out to Diamond Head Crater. It's a pretty easy hike. It's not that long, but the views of Honolulu are amazing. It's just so beautiful. I'm actually going to show you a picture for those of you watching on YouTube of me at the top of the crater and then the view of Honolulu from the top of the crater. So this is me at the top of the Diamond Head Crater looking down. This is actually taken from the direction away from Honolulu, but you can see like the beautiful water and how lush and green it is. And just, I mean, it's a pretty easy hike, pretty short, but really, really well worth the views. And let me show you the view in the other direction. And then this is the view towards Honolulu. So Honolulu is a little bit more of a sprawling city, and it sprawls up the coast. And again, this view is just amazing. But when it comes to hiking, because Hawaii is it's so volcanic, these islands are volcanic islands. There is so much really interesting terrain, especially in the center of the islands. So what I would recommend is renting a car, renting a Jeep, whatever, and going into the center of the island for a hike. It is truly, truly incredible. I'll show you a picture from there and then tell you a little fun hiking story. So this is me on my island hike. And again, for those of you that are just listening, I'm going up this super steep incline in essentially a forest of bamboo shoots. So what my brother and I did was we drove out, we found a hiking trail, drove out, and we didn't realize in Oahu, there's a ridge, again, volcanic islands, there's a ridge that goes down the center of the island. We didn't realize we were hiking straight up the ridge. It was one of the most grueling hikes I've ever been on, and we got lost. We're on the top of the ridge, and I'm talking this ridge is so narrow at certain points that it's maybe 4 feet wide. And we're hiking, we're trying to get to this waterfall, and eventually we found it. But it took us forever. We got lost. Our hike that was supposed to be like 2 to 3 hours, we were there for 8 hours. And at one point, it starts pouring rain. We came back so exhausted and battered and bruised, but 10 out of 10 would recommend. It was really incredible. And certain parts of this hike were so steep that people that maintain the trails have come and tied ropes and hoses so that you can help physically pull yourself up, because otherwise you're going to be crawling. All right, now let's talk bars and restaurants. So my favorite bar in Honolulu, and you guys might notice a theme in my episodes that I really, really love speakeasies. There's a speakeasy called the Blind Ox that some of the best cocktails I've ever had, especially their whiskey-based cocktails, and they have a bone marrow appetizer that is literally, I would murder for this. I wouldn't murder. I would contemplate it though, for this appetizer. And what I love about this speakeasy is the building that it's in, the walls, their windows are blacked out. You would not know it's there unless like you're following the address. And when you get in, I'll post a picture of it as well. It's this like red velvet couches and red and gold wallpaper, and it's super dark and luxurious looking. Let me show you a picture. And so you can see this just like this beautiful crystal chandelier, and the ceiling is these gold ornate tiles. Coming down the walls is this red and gold, very kind of Victorian styled wallpaper. And all of the booths are like red leather, red velvet. And then of course on the wall to the left, you can see the Blind Ox portrait, which it's named after. My second favorite bar is called the Hideout. It's at the Lalo, which is the Lalo is the hotel. And it's a rooftop bar. It's really laid back and tropical. I mean, granted, with Hawaii in general, the pace is so much more laid back. Part of me is like, man, I would love to live here. And part of me is like, I couldn't do this. But they have great food all day, great drinks. For dinner, they had this, it was Brussels sprouts with like pork belly. Oh my goodness. Also, the pork that you're going to get, like pork belly, pork anything, cooked pork, is so good in Honolulu. Like, they do it better probably than anywhere. I don't care. I don't care about barbecue, whatever. Like, whatever they do, it's working. And it's absolutely amazing. So the Hideout at Layla would be my second choice. And may not be a likely candidate, but literally one of the best, most fun bars I've ever been to is Kelly O'Neill's. So obviously, by the name sounds, it is an Irish pub, and it is one of the few places in Waikiki that's open till 4 a.m. And it is so much fun. I've been there several times on different trips, and every time I'm there, it's the best people. Everybody's having the best time. It's great drinks, high quality bar food, super laid back. And so if you're out partying, you're going to end up at Kelly O'Neill's. You just will. It's just going to happen. And I will say, for you club people, you club dancing party people, you need to go to Chinatown. I'm not a club person. I've mentioned this before, that clubs give me anxiety. But if that's your vibe, go to Chinatown, dance your ass off, and then you're going to go back to Kelly O'Neill's. And let's talk food. I love food so much. And one of the things about places like Hawaii, and we'll get more into this when I'm going to start doing international episodes as well. And I want to find local cuisine. I understand why, sometimes people go and they want to eat at a restaurant they're familiar with. I am not like that. I'm like, what, but what do you guys eat? I don't think I could try brains. I don't know that I could do that. But I've eaten some pretty crazy shit over the years. But for local, authentic Hawaiian food, Helena's Hawaiian food. I literally rented a car to be able to drive and find this place because every local I talked to was like, this is where you got to go. This is where you got to go. This is where you got to go. Look at this plate. It's actually incorrect to call this a plate. It is plates. And we had pulled pork and oxtail and like literally, and this spread, there are, let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 small plates. This cost us $23. And it was the best food that I've had in Hawaii. And on this note of like local Hawaiian food, when you're in Hawaii, especially if it's your first time, do go to a luau. They're a super touristy thing? Yes, of course. But it is so interesting. Like if you're going to go to a place that has so much rich culture, enjoy it and celebrate it. And the food is great. Why wouldn't you want to go? Really, really incredible. But Helena's Hawaiian food is the place to go. Get some local Hawaiian food. And moving on with more food. So again, cultural cuisines. So Hawaii has and has always had a very large Asian population. There's probably more Asians there than any other nationality at this point. And I happen to be a big fan of Vietnamese food. There is a restaurant called The Pig and the Lady. And it is honestly, there might be a place in LA that can compete with it, but probably the best Vietnamese food that I've ever had. They have like this really delicious escargot that's baked in green curry. And it is one of the most beautiful, wonderful things I have ever tasted. So if you like Asian cuisine, you're going to try something new. I would say, especially with the history of like the Asian culture in Honolulu, you're going to get some of the best Asian food you've ever had there. And I will say across the board, because again, I've been to Honolulu several times. And I mean, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Korean, the sushi are all top notch. So you can definitely find plenty of options in any of those categories. I mean, again, Honolulu has an amazing Chinatown, but the Vietnamese at that particular place was just so good. And presumably, since most people are going to Honolulu for vacation, do brunch at Over Easy. It is some of the best brunch food I have ever had. Extremely high quality. Everything was cooked to perfection. Nothing felt like anything other than like just pulled from the garden fresh. And there's a big outdoor seating area. It's just so refreshing and vibrant. So brunch folks, definitely go to Over Easy. And for the music portion, I kind of wanted to focus on one artist for this episode simply because of my personal story with this. So when I was there with my brother, we decided to go to the Blue Note and we ended up recruiting a bunch of people that we had met while we were there. And again, I love jazz. That's come up in a couple episodes. There was a local artist playing who's originally from the North Shore that we went to go see, whose name is Thunderstorm Artis. I am not kidding you. That's his actual name. And we went into this, event. I've been to the Blue Note in New York. Didn't know anything about him as an artist. Just wanted to see some local music. My brother's also really, really passionate about music. Has great music taste. And so I see his name and I'm like, Thunderstorm Art, what? And I read about him that he's from Hawaii. And I was like, okay, we're here in Hawaii. He's from Hawaii. We're going to go see him. He was born on the North Shore. And I didn't realize this at the time, but I found out that he was a finalist on season 18 on The Voice. And truly, truly one of the most magical shows I've ever seen. And it's interesting. He lives in Nashville now with his wife, and his wife actually sang with him at that show. His sister played keys for him. And his sister, too, was just like, she walked out just radiating joy and passion. And there was so much positive energy in the room that I remember looking over at my brother, and my brother is 6'3", jacked, military, and he's just tears just streaming down his face, and I'm crying. And it was this joy of like being alive and that there's magic and there's hope. And we tried to go back and see him the next night, but the event was sold out. It was so moving. And he's very much, it's like layered guitar and intimate storytelling. And he's got this neo soul kind of Leon Bridges vibe to him. That is some of the best music I have ever heard in my life. not just the best in Honolulu. So for today, I just wanted to kind of focus on him. There was live music all along Waikiki during the day, and in the evenings we heard some great cover bands, but Thunderstorm was just truly magical. Sometimes I think, we all have these instances where you meet someone who is doing exactly what their calling should be. You're like, man, this is perfect for you. You were made for this. That was really, truly a magical moment. As a singer and as a front person, I've never been in a room, I don't think in a concert, that was quite that powerful. So for this week, and I'm going to blast him on my social medias as well, like, go check out Thunderstorm Artis and follow him on Instagram, and just his journey and his beautiful life and the joy that he brings. And I promise you won't regret it. And that is it for today. Thank you so much for joining me on the road. And again, a little boat ride and a plane ride all the way over to Honolulu for the Massey affair. This was another story. I really try to lean into stories that are not as well known. This was not something that I had heard of ever before, and I love it. And again, my email is montyashleymater. It's always in the show notes. If you have recommendations for a true crime story or a city to visit, please send them my way. I am here for it. And I just want to give a little disclaimer, and I'll give another one next week and the week following. The next 2 episodes are real brutal, especially episode 10 is going to be a journey. It is a rough ride. Brace yourselves. We're going deep true crime. I've been gentle with you up to this point. We're going deep true crime. We're going to turn up the heat a little bit next week for episode 9. We'll really crank it up for episode 10. I have a little surprise for you on that one. Thank you so much for joining me on the highway. I will see you next week. Again, my name is Monty Mater. Thank you for joining me on Highway to Hell.